Just a quick mic check. Can you guys all hear me fine? At the back? Yep, cool, right. What I'd like to talk to you guys about today is kind of like a philosophy I've had for quite some time. And that's the proposal that we are digital architects. Because I believe that we, as web people, designers, UX, borrow more from the world of architecture than we do from the world of graphic design, which has influenced our industry for the last 20 years. So I'm going to want to go through evolving our design language, so the language of the graphic design which has influenced us, looking at the language of the digital architect and also the responsibilities of the digital architects. Now, just in the beginning, I want to say this, I'm not suggesting a new paradigm that suddenly everyone on their CV says we are digital architects. This is kind of like a conceptual thing, and it'll make more sense as we go through. So evolving our design language. There was an American comedian by the name of George Carlin. He was very controversial, very provocative. But one thing that used to run throughout his work was words and how certain things can imply different meanings than what we even actually realize. And he once said, we think in language, so the quality of our thoughts will only ever be as good as the quality of our language. And I think about the language that we use in our industry as designers. And it becomes very clear that it's heavily influenced by graphic design, and I think incorrectly so. So for example, above the fold. This makes sense in the print world, but what are we folding? I know someone might say, well, you know, touch screens will soon be foldable, maybe at that point, but really. And just that statement has made us design websites by pushing everything up at the top, without realizing the environment that we're actually designing in. Then you get the kind of language where they're fake questions. Well, I believe they're fake questions. So, should designers code? And I'm like, should artists mix paint? How can you really design in an environment without really understanding how it works? And then you get the debates, the this versus that. And every year it's fashionable. You just have to read any of the magazines and the blogs. So, native versus web. Now, I believe implementation is important. But really, when you're trying to challenge the brief that's been set for you, you shouldn't be thinking about how I'm going to implement this. You should be thinking about discovering the ideas. How do I solve my client's problems or my users' problems? Saying, right, I'm going to design a website or a web app or an application. You need to be thinking about the bigger picture. But if an award was to go to the most superficial of superficial, then we have to stand in awe of this debate, which you guys, judging by the reaction, all know. Now, I have to be very careful not to sound really ranty and angry, because this debate really does frustrate me. For many reasons, partly because it feels that the words skeuomorphic and flat, the comparison, they're not antithetical. Just to explain, skeuomorphic isn't realism, it's not embossed, embeveled, it can have those elements, but what skeuomorphic actually is imitation. Imitation, with the important fact being it had to be necessary in the original. So an example of a skeuomorphic app, which, incidentally, is stylistically flat, would be Stickies. Stickies is purely skeuomorphic. It borrows everything from sticky note paper, from the garish colours to this darkened colour across the top, because where the glue is on sticky paper. It's designed specifically to tell the user this is for writing notes, this isn't for writing your PhD dissertation. It's skeuomorphic, but stylistically it's flat. So why are we comparing the two? But then what is flat design? Flat design is the lack of dimension. Flat design is clean lines. Flat design is incredibly boring, not new at all. At all. And it's lazy language. I mean, come on, flat design? Everything we design is flat. And like, if we were going to be inspired and be really sincere in the language, we could have named it after pop art, Bauhaus, Art Nouveau, our push block design, but flat? Really? And this is the point. This is the language of the graphic designer. And that's not a slur on graphic design. Classical graphic design was really typographic design, and I have so much love for that. But the graphic design, the digital graphic design has really influenced us. And this was picked up on by Eric Spiekermann. Does everyone know who Eric Spiekermann is? You should do. Famous typographer. You've probably used this typeface. He designed, more recently, Freer Sans, which was like the Mozilla font. Meta is another font I believe he designed. Really famous typographer. And when he was asked how he defined himself, he called himself a typographic designer. And when pushed further, it's like, so what is a graphic designer? He said, a graphic designer has an idea in their head, like blue and wobbly. And they say, well, I'm going to do whatever it takes to make this design blue and wobbly. Whatever, you know, designing from the outside, working in. And you can replace blue and wobbly with flat design, realism, rough and ragged, grunge, whatever. It's the same thing. And think about how websites are traditionally being designed. We do a 600 pixel header, then we'll, you know, with lots of graphics and a logo. Then a 600 pixel footer. Then a sidebar with a few tag clouds, and then copy and paste Lorem Ipsum. Designing from the outside in. A digital architect would be designing from the inside out. You know, you always hear content is king and it's bounded around, but really, are we designing as content is king? Shouldn't we be thinking about the content first and designing outwards? And then all of the above the fold, I mean, all that has affected the way we create sites, and even the way we present sites, and the tools that we use. So, what is the language of the digital architect? Well, to look at the digital architect, it would be worth going to the real architects. And I want to talk about Louis Kahn, who was an American architect in the 20th century. And he believed in having conversations with his materials. He was that crazy. In front of a classroom full of students, he would pick up a brick and start saying, hello, brick, what would you like to be? And the brick would say, I want to be an archway, please. He says, like, but come on, brick, archways are expensive. You know, how about I pour concrete on top of you? How about I do the blue and wobbly equivalent, making the definition beforehand, you know, before you've actually discovered the bricks. Now I'd like to be an arch. He believed that you had to have conversation with the materials that we're using, that the language that you're using was important. Because in order to create thoughtful spaces, you had to honor the materials that we were using. And this goes throughout all of his work. He stuck to very simplistic materials for the time, because at the time it was very postmodernistic, really featured or very clean, very soulless, like the typeface Helvetica. And he wanted things which had meaning, so he would use concrete and brick and occasionally wood. One building he designed in particular was the Salk Institute. And the brief that was set for this was design a space where science and art can coexist, because the founders believed that science and art was essentially the same thing. The difference was the application, meaning it's all about discovery. So when you walk around the building, it's very functional. But Louis Kahn deliberately put all these weird spaces, like you'll put a doorway or a stairwell that pokes out of the edge, so that it encourages people to literally walk around and discover something. He's literally trying to say, explore. And every now and again, you would find a space and a pattern which would repeat itself. But he believed that you could only do this if you honored the materials. And if the only way you could honor the materials is if you had conversations with them to really understand what they were about. And like, you know, responsive web design is really big. But responsive web design actually comes from architecture, because it was responsive architecture, responding and understanding the environment that you're in. So he believed architecture was the thoughtful making of spaces, that every building had a soul, but you could only do this if you honored the materials that you were using. So how do we apply that to us? And what are our materials? The material of the web, sadly, is the most neglected thing. And that's typography, or HTML tags. You know, I don't feel that we honor the material as much as we should, or give it the credit as much as we should. Now, there's been technical restrictions for years, but even so, limitations can actually be liberating. So the first thing I like to do is collect all the tags on a page to start formulating a style guide, to see how different elements play with each other and react to one another. The next thing I'll do is I'll choose a typeface that represents the content. Now, a graphic designer quite often will open up Photoshop and just, or Illustrator or whatever, and just go 1 font, 2 font, 3 font, just go down the whole list. I haven't used this one before, fine. Really, what we should be doing, and we're all guilty of this, including myself, is trying to research what the typographer was trying to say. And every typeface has a history and a story. So Times New Roman was designed specifically to get as many characters on a line as possible. Because like other typefaces like Castellon and Garamond were quite wide in nature. And then you have Matthew Carter, who designed Georgia, Vidana, Tahoma, they were designed for Microsoft, specifically for the screen. So when choosing a typeface which represents the content, we should be thinking about what was the typographer really saying. Once we've done that, we start looking at the relationship between elements. Why should the header be 42 pixels, the subheader 26? What is defining this ratio? And as I'm using the word ratio, does everyone know what the golden ratio is?
Yeah.
Cool, this is really easy now. So, again, the golden ratio appears in architecture. Roman architecture in particular, they used to use, the way they defined beauty mathematically was this ratio, which for those of you who don't know, is that. So the idea is literally like the pattern, you times it by the golden ratio, you get the next size and space upwards. So what I like to do is say take a base font size, 16 pixels for the sake of argument. Times it by the golden ratio, you get 26 rounded up. What that does is it gives you the next item in the scale and also a desired line height. Now line height is a bit of a hornet's nest, but we can talk about that later outside in the bar or whatever. Then what you do is you keep going, carrying on the pattern, times by the golden ratio, and you keep going up. Now, in the elements of typography, what they also do with scale is they'll take the first element, divide it by 2, and they'll start the golden ratio again, and then you have 2 sequences, and that's not the golden ratio. I've been told off by a lot of mathematicians. I know that Elements of Typography is a really big book, but still. Anyway, so keep it simple. And if you want to convert it to EMs, fine. Now, that's great, but that font size, the base font size, is defined by the characters per line and the width where we sit. Now, traditional graphic design, it's great because we had fixed pixels, so we could figure out how many characters on a single line. Characters per line is another hornet's nest because some people say 55 characters per line to 70. Again, it depends on the typeface. But the problem that we have is responsive web design. Because if you're thinking about the amount of characters per line, and that defines how many, the font size, how do you manage that? Because column widths are always changing. That should be defining the size of the typeface. So when you hear the term responsive typography, surely font sizes should also be changing responsively. Now, there's a lot of experiments online. I've seen ones with cameras where the font size will change depending on how a person close is. And there's lots of other crazy ideas. Now, I was thinking, okay, if I'm going to be sincere in what the stuff I'm saying, I need to be honoring the materials. I need to really be experimenting with these things. So I made a prototype. It's not production-ready code. I do not recommend anybody using it in their websites at all. But it's to illustrate a point. And the idea is this. I think the golden ratio is quite important. I think having a desired characters per line is quite important. What we get is, we figure out the width of this element which is fluid. From that we do some clever maths and we find out what the ideal characters per line or the defined characters per line would be for the paragraph. Then we scale up and down, times in by the golden ratio. So that looks great. But what happens when the browser window size changes? The type should be responsive and change as well. Now, this is where I take a left, because originally I did this talk at the Future of Web Design. Me and Jason Pimentel, who was also one of the main star speakers at the conference, were talking about this and characters per line. And I started thinking, well, really we need that as a CSS property. So I started emailing the W3C list, and I didn't get a response. So I emailed again. So then I went to the W3 website, and I emailed everyone on the list, and they said, oh, yeah, thanks, we got your first email. I'm tenacious. They said, characters per line is cool, but the thing is, every character has a different width. And by the way, we've already done it. And I'd never heard of this before. These two units are known as font-dependent units. CH is basically equivalent of characters per line. I don't know, has anyone actually heard of this? Great, because I hadn't up until about 2 weeks ago either. So the idea is this. CH is defined by the width of the 0 glyph, the 0 character in a typeface. So 75 CH will be the equivalent of 75 zeros. And but it's a CSS-free property, so it'll only work in more modern browsers. The cool thing is, though, 1 CH is the equivalent of 0.5 EM. And we have the EX property, which is X height. And surprisingly enough, this is supported by Internet Explorer 7 and 8, which I'd never heard before. But then there's an argument, do you really need it? EMs could possibly do the job. So, yeah, something to think about. And it kind of makes my prototype maybe redundant, I don't know. The problem with responsive typography, we could use media queries, there's also viewport units. It's an experimental time, and I'd recommend everyone to actually start thinking about these things. Because that's one of our responsibilities, but it's not the only one. To look at the responsibilities of the digital architect, this time we go back 400 years into the past, and talk about one architect in particular whose name is Mir Sinan. He was the chief Ottoman architect and designed over 300 buildings in his career. His buildings inspired the Taj Mahal, very famous in Asia, not so much known over here. And he was a very interesting character. He wasn't ashamed of the fact that he was inspired by everything and incorporated Greek architecture, the Byzantium architecture, everywhere. He would absorb everything. But one building that he built in Istanbul, his brief that was set to him was, we need a building that rivals all of the other empires. It has to be the jewel in the crown. And it had to be named after the Sultan, otherwise you get in trouble. So this is the Süleymaniye Mosque. This is what it looks like today. It's, as well as being a religious building, it housed religious schools, non-religious schools, Turkish baths, whatever. Now, this is like over 400 years old. Designing a building back then, one of the main problems was light. During the day, you can sculpt the position of windows to highlight where the pulpit is or whatever. But at night, you had to use these massive oil lamps. Now, the story goes that the Sultan was going down to the complex to see what Sinan was actually doing, only to see him sitting in the middle, smoking a peace pipe. And the Sultan goes, "What the hell are you doing?" He goes, "I'm testing. I'm testing the airflow system." You see, throughout the dome and in other parts of the building, you have these holes. Those holes lead to an upper room above the main doorway, known as the workroom. He was designing the space to collect the smoke. Not only that, but at the end of all of these holes, you had this cone-like paper which collected the soot. Because when you mix soot with water, it creates a pigment known as lamp black, which scribes would use to write, and it's still used today, and it's like super permanent. He was smoking a pipe, testing his ideas, which I think is great. I can't get away with that at work because of smoking laws, unfortunately. But what Sinan was trying to do was understand the problem, putting himself in the context and understanding the experience. Because no one remembers a good experience for being a good experience. It's just nice clean air, but you'll remember it if it's very smoky. So it's understand, and he would build in iterations. He would do smoke tests, right, smoking is cool, we're clearing it out. Then he'll work on the acoustics and build on like that, complete iteration, which the digital graphic designer wouldn't do. What digital graphic design does is, here's my website, Photoshop JPEG, right, that's it. Why? Why did you do this? Because I'm a designer. You cannot question me. But really the digital architect is working on it, iterate, think about it, test it, understand from the perspective of the user. Great icons are fantastic, but they make no difference if people don't understand what they mean. Like the burger icon. I think Luke Lebowski, the first guy, he found that most users don't actually know what the burger icon means, but it's everywhere. Like the most usable thing is writing menu. It's so obvious. But how many of us really test the work that we do? And look at the tools that we're using. I mean, think about it. The one thing we never inherited from graphic design is the one thing we should have. No print designer or graphic designer has ever designed layouts in Photoshop. But we do. Why? So the tools are flawed. So what I like to do, and what I've been doing a lot recently, is I'll design something in any design tool just to get things down. And then I'll start prototyping. So sometimes I might use Bootstrap and Foundation because it's working on UI elements, working with the client, working with the product owner or whoever you're designing something for. Just like, is this what we're trying to get? Will this solve the problem? Does this answer the user story? Then I'll start doing stuff in Xura. Xura really helps for testing flows. I don't know, has anyone used Xura here? Yeah. Okay, cool. Xura is quite expensive, so there is like a much more cheaper alternative, Marvel App. Marvel App is essentially, it's a lovely application. Basically, you can take pictures of your layouts or have JPEG images. You connect it to your Dropbox account, and then in Marvel App you can just make click-through like a click-through thing. It will generate a link for you. You can send it to someone, talk to them on the phone, say, "What do you think of my design? Yeah, it's great, but could you change that? Yeah, 1 second," and it automatically updates the link for you. I recommend it. I mean, in art college, what our tutors used to make us do is when we draw an illustration or a picture or whatever, they say, "Hold up to a mirror," because the problem is you get this visual bias. But when you hold up to a mirror, it reverses it to the point where you can see when the perspective is out and it looks flawed. You see it straight away like that. Designing flows is the equivalent of that. Like, design a flow, do a screencast, and just see how it looks. See if it makes sense to you. Quite often, you'll put, well, what I used to do is I put like a modal box, an input, you know, essentially continually asking the user or the person I'm speaking to, make a decision, make a decision. But then when you realize that really experiences should be seamless, you shouldn't be asking the users questions, you should be letting, it should just work. That's why Dropbox is so successful, because it just works. The next thing that you want to do is testing. Now this is another thing which designers find very tricky. Because testing's not really in our DNA, or even our sort of career structure. You're not really taught this. But it's really good to do. And it's a real eye-opener when you put your precious design in front of a user and they say, "I don't like that. It doesn't make sense to me." So, using screencasts occasionally, just so that the user can see the flow, we'll send it to them, we'll do interviews over Skype, we'll do interviews in person just to get an idea, does this solve the problem that you're having? Which is great. Sometimes we do surveys to try and understand, especially with an existing application or a website, what is the core features that someone would need? You know, what will they do without? What can they do? What would they, you know, really need? Which I just basically repeated myself, but anyway. But asking questions is quite difficult, because it's very difficult to ask a question that's not leading. And I'm lucky that I work with a guy who's like a doctor in interactive design, but it's a tool that we need to do. I mean, this is quite an expensive one, but you've got like SurveyMonkey. But getting into the habit of asking your users these questions, trying to understand them, and then Optimizely, which is the iterative space. Optimizely, does everyone know Optimizely? I'm asking you guys questions because I just want to. Has everyone heard of Optimizely? Okay. A/B testing. Essentially what A/B testing is you have two designs. 50% of your audience see one, 50% see the other. And then you basically make a judgment on whatever the thing you're testing. So a purchase flow. Was one got more sales than the other? But you have to be very careful again, because you could be easily testing the wrong things in A/B testing. Sometimes it's simple stuff like copy. People will test to see what copy is more. Like click now might be more clickable than click, for example. The danger about A/B testing is marketing departments have embraced it and they know nothing about design. So if you want your designs to be ruined by people that, then really learn about A/B testing. I recommend it. So in summary, the purpose of this is to ignore the superficial language, because I think it's all blockers. If you're making decisions before you've gone to a discovery phase, you've kind of failed the thing that you're trying to do. So we need to put down the flat, the debates, you know. If it's valid, it's valid. But really, flat? We need to have conversations with our tools, and I don't mean being completely schizophrenic and just talking to HTML pages, but I mean understand the environment. That's what responsive web design was all about, really understanding the space. It's not fixed, it's supposed to be fluid. Why are we fighting against it? The tragic thing about responsive web design is now it's become an implementation detail. So if it's responsive images, fluid grids, and media queries, it's responsive web design. If it doesn't use those things in a standard way, it's not. So for example, Google Plus use media queries, but not in the way that you would think. And it works on all the devices, but it's not counted as responsive web design because it doesn't fit this technical paradigm. I mean, again, it's not about the language and the sort of like superficial, you know, implementation thing that was looking at a higher level, really understanding the environment that we're creating with our things in. And the only way we can do that is by having conversations with our tools. And finally, test and validate. This is really important. It makes you a better designer to really question the thing that you're doing in the first place. But the running thread throughout all this are these 3 words. Now, last year I went to a workshop with Stefan Sagmeister, who's a really famous designer. And he always talked about uncertainty a lot. Like, if he doesn't have that sick feeling in the pit of his stomach, he thinks he's doing something wrong. If he has that feeling, he goes, okay, right, I'm on to a winner. Because when you're really uncertain, you really try hard. And when you're uncertain, you start in the uncertain path, you start looking at discovery and finding things you never even knew existed. Really exploring the design, really exploring how can I solve this problem using anything. Not thinking about technologies, not thinking about techniques, no, just how do I explore that? And that's what the creative process really is. Because I believe that's essentially what a digital architect has to go through in order to create something that's quite worthwhile and meaningful. Thanks.